This week on the agenda, talking trade. Just what does that meeting between China and the United States in London mean for the future of globalization? "2025 has been, shall we say, a rocky year when it comes to relations between the world's two largest economies. But following a meeting between China and the US in London this week, there's been what Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng called notable progress in addressing each other's trade and economic concerns. So what does this mean for future relations between the two nations and indeed the rest of the world? Joining me now is Max Baucus, former US Senator and ex-US Ambassador to China. Thanks for coming on the agenda. Now, since those Geneva talks last month, the US and China have been sparring over everything from rare earth minerals to student visas. It's been a war of words, but following the meeting in London, how would you say the tone has shifted?
I think both countries definitely realize now that they need each other. Back in Geneva, frankly, China had some advantage because the U.S. is less likely to withstand pain, less able to withstand pain with the tariffs than China. And that caused President Trump, frankly, to blink and agree to lower the U.S. tariffs from 145 down to maybe 30, whatever they are. And China also lowered its tariffs from 135 down to about 10. But the point is that Trump blinked because he faced a lot of pressure at home. U.S. companies, consumers, farmers, and ranchers just could not stand those potential tariffs that were being imposed by China on U.S. goods. So he blinked.
Yeah.
Now, since then, we've met in London. And I think London shows that that export controls and rare earth materials are so existential to both countries.
Yeah.
We now realize we need each other. U.S. needs Chinese rare earths for its cars, for its military, et cetera. And China would very much like U.S. export controls on jet engines and many other technologies to be relaxed. Is a major new development, which to me indicates that both countries need each other, and they're starting to recognize that they need each other, and that's good news.
You say both countries need each other. I wonder how much hinges, though, on the relationship between the two presidents. You know, I'm thinking about the recent phone conversation between President Xi and President Trump.
Well, frankly, I think that if Trump had not been elected, if Joe Biden had been elected, and maybe he would no longer be president because of his health, and Kamala Harris would be president. But under that administration, I think it would be business as usual between the U.S. and China, and basically that's not very good. The U.S. policy under Biden, I'm a Democrat and I support Joe Biden, but I frankly think that the policy under the Biden administration toward China was a little stillborn. It was just not very creative. It was just pretty much get our allies together and be very competitive against China. It did not address the real question, that is, long-term, what is our relationship with China? And how do we find a relationship with China that works pretty well for both countries? That question was never addressed. But Trump now is starting to mix things up. He had a phone call with Xi, maybe a couple of phone calls. We don't really know. But the point is that he's instructed his negotiators, Lutnick and Besant and Greer, to try to work out a deal with China, just as China has instructed its negotiator, He Lifeng, to try to work out a deal. And they've done so because they realize, in my judgment, that both countries realize that we really do need to work together better. And name calling just isn't working very well. We need to figure out some way to work together.
You mentioned the negotiators, and they've said notable progress was made in addressing each other's trade and economic concerns. And a framework is now in place to proceed. So are the world's two largest economies back in business?
Well, you know, some details are starting to leak out from the London Agreement. One is very important, and that is China has maintained its regime, its system with respect to its export controls on its materials, its rare earth materials to the United States, but is giving a 6-month reprieve. So that China is saying, okay, we will grant licenses, but they'll be pretty particular. Licenses to U.S. companies so China can, so U.S. companies can get rare earths from China, but it's a 6-month only reprieve. That gives China a lot of leverage. That gives China leverage to watch to see whether the U.S. lives up to its part of the deal. The U.S. is saying under its part of the deal that it will relax export controls. Well, that is very, very significant because up till now, the U.S. has maintained that export controls on certain technologies to China were not off the table. I mean, could not be put on the table. They're non-negotiable, but from a national security point of view. But right now, China very cleverly is using rare earths as leverage to say, okay, we'll agree to this 6-month reprieve, but only 6 months, so long as you, United States, live up to your end of the deal, which is to relax export controls. So each side is really under the gun here to follow up on its commitment, but the 6-month choke point reprieve that China has given gives it a lot of leverage.
As you say, the details will continue to come out about what exactly has been agreed from rare earth minerals to technology exports. But what do you think would constitute a win for the United States? You know, Donald Trump's initial response has certainly seemed positive.
Well, a win, frankly, would be for China to say, okay, we give up, we'll grant licenses to U.S. companies to receive China rare earths. Now, China didn't do that. China said, okay, we will for 6 months, but not only for 6 months. We'll see whether you, United States, live up to your end of the deal. So a win would be for China to just say, okay, you could go ahead and get our winner, get our rare earths. But Trump didn't get that.
And what about for China? What would be win-win for China?
Well, a huge big win for China would be a relaxation of export controls, U.S. export controls, and also reducing the U.S. tariffs on Chinese products going into the United States. Now, right now, I think they're roughly about 30–40% of Chinese products coming into the U.S. and maybe 10% into China. Now, U.S. companies could live with that. It's not good, where they can live with it. And I think there'll be some future reduction of tariffs both sides, but not a lot. I think we're pretty close to what the norm's going to be indefinitely. The real play is going to be on rare earths and export controls. That's the headline. That's the focus, and that's what's most important for both countries at this point.
But I also don't think we should underestimate this consensus that's been reached on the framework, on that framework for how negotiations will proceed, even though, as you say, no date is yet in the diary. I do wonder, though, to what extent you think the damage has already been done to financial markets, to supply chains, to the broader global economy.
No question. There's been very significant damage to supply chains for a couple of reasons. One is that President Trump's on-again, off-again tariffs. It causes immense uncertainty. Businessmen have a hard time planning. It also undermines trust. If the United States says it reached an agreement with a certain country on tariffs, the other country will think, well, gee, Trump might change his mind. That undermines trust. And at the same time, the United States and China have both been kind of retrenching, digging down to be more self-sufficient. U.S. certainly has, by pulling up the drawbridge in certain areas, as is China. China wants to be very much more self-sufficient. China does not want to have to rely on the United States, and the U.S. does not want to have to rely on China. And that tends to disrupt supply chains. No question about it, and it's very, very unfortunate. And I feel that there's an opportunity here, post-London, to reach a very significant agreement to relax a lot of these restrictions which disrupt supply chains. A huge opportunity, and let's hope that it happens. Well, I don't know. Words are nice, but deeds, actions mean much more. So we'll see if both countries can reach a meaningful, responsible agreement, and that will help the supply chain issue.
You talk about challenges, you talk about opportunity, but is a fragmented global economy now inevitable?
Oh, yeah. We're the two biggest countries, U.S. and China. I forgot the statistics, but you know, China's GDP, add to U.S. GDP, it's quite significant.
Yeah.
And and there's also a sort of a global leadership question here. Many countries, Western countries, have relied on the United States to kind of set the tone and set the standards for trade agreements, for many other kinds of agreements, and that's being diminished. There's been backsliding here. The United States is no longer the premier Western leader as it was at the end of World War II and for about 20, 30 years following. Because the United States now is imposing tariffs on allies, steel, aluminum, whatnot, which is causing allies to be very nervous about the United States, whether they trust the United States. The U.S. is having a very significant effect on the economies in Europe and other Western countries. Same thing with China. China is doing it a bit differently. China is expanding its Belt and Road Initiative. It's very strong agreements deep agreements, commercial agreements in the global South, in South America, in Africa. Slowly, it's gaining advantage in those countries, and it's really becoming more of a bipolar, or a multipolar world in the sense that China's kind of one pole, and the United States was one pole, but the United States is backing off a little bit and causing other countries, let's say European countries, to do deals among themselves at the expense of the United States. And that's partly because the United States is too much involved in America first, and involved in itself, rather than working with other countries.
In which case, what's your outlook then for China-US long-term relations? Is it going to diminish in importance?
Depends what long-term means. I think we're at a point where the waters are rough. It's rough sailing. The relationship between U.S. and China has plummeted in the last 10 years. It's become its low point in the last 10 years, much lower than when I served. I served in Beijing in 2014 and 17, and the relationship was pretty good, U.S.-China. U.S. sent over lots of secretaries, cabinet secretaries, and there were a lot of meetings. I was, as ambassador, able to see anybody I wanted to see in the Chinese government. It was quite open. It worked pretty well. But since then, the relationship has deteriorated, and it's been much more difficult for Chinese ambassadors to get access in the U.S. Senate, or in the government, and it's more difficult for the U.S. ambassador in Beijing to get access the last several years. We're in a bad spot. However, I think that this new development, that is rare earths versus export controls, is positive, because it shows that we do need each other much more than we thought that we did. It's showing maybe it makes some sense to work out some agreement on these areas, rather than calling it being too hawkish toward China, or China too hawkish toward the United States. Now, we'll see. China wants to be self-sufficient. The U.S. wants to be self-sufficient. That goes counter to working together. So it'll be difficult. It'll be interesting to see how this turns out. My hope is that this London framework will tend to cause countries, realizing they have to work together, to also realize that maybe it makes some sense not to be as self-sufficient as we thought we would be, maybe up until now. We'll see.
Max Baucus, thank you very much.
You bet. Hope it helps.
Welcome back to The Agenda. Earlier this year, when Donald Trump was in full-on tariff mode, throwing out increasing duties on the rest of the world on what seemed like a daily basis, many experts have begun to predict the end of globalization. So is that where we are now? Or is there still a chance to pull back from that brink? With me now is Henry Gao, Professor of Law and Lee Kong Chian Fellow at Singapore Management University. Great to have you on the agenda. So Henry, the US and China are now talking to each other and candidly and rationally, we're told. What do you think this says about the future of globalization?
Well, this is a sort of a limited good news in the sense that the communication channels are still open between the US and China, the two largest players in global trade. But I think we have to take this result with some caution because despite the ability to maintain communication channels, as I mentioned earlier, I think the meeting only resolved a tiny bit of the differences and the bilateral trade restrictions that both sides has imposed on the other. So I think if you look at the bilateral negotiation between US and China, I mean, they still has at least 2 months to go before the 3 months deadline runs out. So I think we would expect more difficult negotiations in the next 2 months. And whether or not the bilateral trade and the global trade can survive would largely depend on the result of these bilateral negotiations for the next 2 months.
The World Bank said this week that the 2020s are going to be the weakest for global growth since the 1960s because of Trump. How have Trump's tariffs changed the global economy?
One thing that the Trump tariffs has changed about the global economy and global trade is that people realize that it is quite risky, actually, for you to rely on export markets as the main engine of growth. So this is a reminder for everyone to start looking more inward to try to boost domestic consumption, which is what China has been trying to do for the past several years since the introduction of the so-called dual circulation program, whereby the government aims to boost not only exports but also domestic consumption. So, I mean, even though global trade would reduce as a result, if this could lead to countries like China to increase more global consumption, I think that is still a good news for the economic growth because, as we all know, economic growth is not just based on exports. If you have a vibrant domestic consumption, that would also help to boost your groups. And I hope that is what we will see for the next few years.
You're talking about the short to medium term. I wonder how you would assess the longer term impacts of these tariffs and the uncertainty that surrounds all the toing and froing.
Well, I think in the long term, one thing is clear that the globalization, as we knew it, the globalization that was ushered in by the WTO since its establishment in 1995 is no longer with us. I think we have to look at global trade from different angles instead of global trade between everyone, US, China, EU, Japan, and other major players. I think more likely what you will say is that, especially between the US and China, there would be less direct trade between the two. And instead, they would each be trading more with their so-called circle of friends, the US with the EU and Japan and other developed countries, and China more with the Belt and Road Initiative countries, including Southeast Asia. So globalization as we knew it is probably over in the long term. But in its place, as I said, this is not necessarily a bad news for economic growth because if we can find other engines of economic growth, like boosting domestic consumption, then that could still deliver good results for the economic growth. It's just not in the form that we are used to.
So in this more fragmented global economy that you're talking about, who do you see as the main players? Is it China? Is it the EU, ASEAN nations, the BRICS nations?
Well, I think one thing is for sure, as I mentioned, there will be less direct trade between US and China, but the countries in between, for example, Southeast Asian countries and other so-called middle powers like Australia, like Canada, probably are going to play a larger role because these countries are the ones which we are trying to maintain friendly relationship with everyone, with both the US and China. And to a limited extent, I think they would be able to do that. So I would say that actually there might be some good news for these middle powers, for these economies, if they can balance out their trade relationship with both China and US as well, because you see China is the largest producer, the US is the largest consumer. So most of these countries would need both countries, both US and China, to be able to involve in global trade. So I think, instead of direct bilateral trade between U.S. and China, as I mentioned, we might see, more like a three-way trade or even four-way trade, and more among all these countries, involving a lot more of the middle powers, the smaller economies. So that could be good news for these economies.
You're talking about smaller powers and middle powers still relying a lot on China and the US, but I wonder if you see a future where the US gets increasingly cut off from the rest of the world. It becomes more isolationist, becomes more protectionist.
Well, there is certainly this possibility. It all depends on how long this tariff war would last. Because when Trump first introduced Liberation Day tariffs, I mean, every country was caught by surprise, right? Because he disregarded the MFN principle and also the tariff banning principle of the WTO, which made it hard for everyone to trade with the US, because if you don't know whether your exports would face a tariff of 3.4% tomorrow or instead 50% tomorrow, there's no way that you could trade with the US. I mean, there has been some signs showing recently that the US might be using the Liberation Day tariffs more as a kind of a leverage to force these countries to negotiate with the US. So we would have to wait and see. If after 3 months, so basically after early July, the results of these negotiations are out and the US agree to a sort of a new equilibrium, a sort of a new baseline tariffs with all these countries, then we could still have some sort of a predictability. But if the US is not satisfied with that, if the US continue to use the tariffs as a kind of weapon to force everyone to keep negotiating with the US, then in the long term, then people are going to be fed up with this tactic, and they are trying to find alternative markets, the EU or China or some other markets rather than the US, because for most businesses, the most important thing is certainty and predictability when it comes to doing business with another partner. So if you do not have the guarantee that the terms of trade with the US would stay the same for the predictable future, then I think a lot of them will try to think of other ways. And that could result in a scenario, as you mentioned, with the US being cut off from the other countries. And that would not be good for the US. That would not be good for the many other economies, because they have to scramble to find alternative markets. And I really hope that doesn't happen.
Henry Gao, thank you very much.
Thank you.
When it comes to world trade, third after the US and China, of course, comes the European Union. So what does this changing tide of globalization mean for Europe? Where are the possible pitfalls and where are the opportunities? Joining me now is Fabrizio Pagani, partner at Italian investment bank Vitale and former chief of staff at the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance. Fabrizio, the talks between China and the United States took place in London after those breakthrough negotiations in Geneva last month. Where does all this leave Europe as the global economic order shifts?
Well, I think it's a great news. It's a good news for Europe. It's a good news for markets. It's the good news for the global economy, because I think, you know, if we have an agreement on trade between the United States and China, the whole world economy is going to bend, and that would mean that also we will have less volatility in market, more certainty for investors, and that would mean also that Europe will thrive on these agreements. I hope this agreement will stand. We don't know yet the details, but if it's confirmed in the next days, and and it takes shape, it would be really a good news.
Where do you see a role for Europe to ease tensions between China and the United States?
Well, Europe is a trading economy. It has been built. It's indeed in the DNA of the European Union. There is free trade within European Union, free movement of goods, free movement of persons, free movement of services and capital, but also free trade across the globe. That was the purpose for which the European Union was built. And so in that sense, everything the European Union will do as much as it can to maintain, improve the existing system of free markets. Of course, there are things which can be adjusted. There are practices which some countries consider unfair, which could be discussed, could be negotiated. Some of these issues can be addressed through the right international fora, including the WTO. European Union is a big supporter of the WTO role. Other issues may be addressed bilaterally with bilateral concessions. And what is important, however, is not to resort to aggressive trading behavior.
So what do you see the role then for Europe in the changing world order?
Well, I think the Europe has to be on the same side, at the same time the custodian of the free trade, because as I said, it's beneficiary in terms of in economic terms, but also in terms of the sort of ideal in which the European Union has been built on. At the same time, we can't be naive, right? If certain practices are deemed unfair, certain behavior by the competing powers is unjust and is damaging for the European economy, in particular certain industry, European Union has all the tools to react with countervailing measures, with tariff in response to these measures. And there is also this new instrument which is called anti-coercion instrument, which is a sort of nuclear, but big bazooka, tool of the last resort in case of really unfair behavior.
Fabrizio, Pagani, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, critical minerals. Who's really winning the race to fuel the future? But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.